Japanese destroyers of World War II included some of the most formidable destroyers, kuchikukan, of their day. This came as a nasty surprise to the Allies, who had generally underestimated Japanese technical capabilities. The Japanese had reassessed their naval needs in the mid-1920s and, placing an emphasis on ship and weapons technology and night fighting expertise, developed a completely new destroyer design. Subsequent development from one destroyer class to the next was not, however, a smooth progression. Aside from the usual changes arising from experience, serious design faults also came to light and naval treaties imposed restrictions. As a result, the early, special-type destroyers required significant changes and the specifications of subsequent classes was reduced in one way or another. Naval treaties were later abrogated in 1937 and so destroyer development continued without regard to limits. Generally speaking, the Imperial Japanese Navy (IJN) requirements gave rise to warships that were substantially larger than most of their European or American equivalents. In the early war years, their advantages were aggressively exploited against the often second-rate and poorly coordinated Allied ships stationed in the region. As at the disastrous Battle of the Java Sea, the Japanese did not, however, continue to install new technology, such as radar, to match their opponents, and destroyer numbers were eroded steadily. The Japanese emphasis on fleet destroyers had neglected the need for large numbers of escort vessels to defend critical merchantmen, a need learned by both the Royal Navy and the United States Navy in the Battle of the Atlantic. In recognition that quantity was as important as quality in some roles, design policy was therefore modified to produce units that were easier to build and operate. Despite this, Japan's destroyer force was halved by the end of the war. The survivors were given to the Allies. Evolution. The oldest Japanese destroyers at the declaration of war with the United States dated from World War I designs and were rated as Class 1, greater than 1,000 tons, standard, or Class 2, under 1,000 tons, standard. As these became outclassed and unsuitable for front-line duties, they were relegated to coastal protection and convoy escort duties, including support of the landings in the Dutch East Indies, now Indonesia, Philippines and Wake Island. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 assigned Japan a tonnage allocation with which it was dissatisfied. IJN planners assessed their needs to protect Japan's maritime lifelines with the assumption that their most likely opponent would be the United States. A total of 144 destroyers was deemed to be necessary in order to achieve a long-ranged fleet capable of operating far from home waters and bases. Treaty limitations were disregarded. Japanese naval strategy assumed a major deciding battle against the United States, and the destroyer's role would have been to harass and reduce the enemy in the lead-up to such a battle. The resultant design was the Fubuki-class destroyer, which were commissioned during 1928 to 1932. The Fubukis became the basis for subsequent destroyer development, but they needed significant modification when stability and hull strength problems became apparent. These modifications were worked into new ship designs. The Japanese produced some unusual and advanced features. The third group of Fubukis introduced a unique splinter-proof torpedo tube turret, later retrofitted, allowing the tubes to be reloaded in action. In addition, they introduced splinter-proof, gas-tight turrets for the 5-inch guns, far ahead of their time. To increase comfort, the forecastle was raised and the bridge enlarged and enclosed, to offer protection against weather in the Pacific. Furthermore, in line with Japan's evident preference for 2 stacks, Fubukis had an unusual Siamese design. The London Naval Treaty added more restrictions to ship design, and displacements were temporarily reduced. Hatsuharu and Shiratsuyu classes, until Japan withdrew from the naval treaties. The subsequent Asashios, Kaijiros, and Yugumos resumed the design evolution and delivered the ships that the IJN desired, with substantially increased displacements. Further technical developments were prototyped in Shimakas, but the design was not continued. Although the anti-aircraft AA defenses of Japanese destroyers were shown to be inadequate, the IJN had recognized the need for Fleet AA defense, and the Akizukis were intended to fill this need. The IJN suffered one problem with their destroyers: small batches of different types, which made standardized spares and training, such as on power plant, impossible. By contrast, the United States Navy's destroyer power plant was standard across hundreds of ships. A substantial number of Japanese destroyers were lost in 1942 in actions around the Solomon Islands. The urgent need for replacements necessitated design simplifications to improve construction speed, and war experience prompted improvements to damage control and anti-aircraft weaponry. The resultant Matsu-class destroyers were commissioned in 1944. Naming history. Due to the anticipated expansion of the Navy, the IJN originally issued numerical designations to every ship. However, the bland numerical designations were unpopular with the officers and crews. The IJN abolished destroyers' numerical designations in August 1928, reverting to names. The reverence held by the Japanese for the arts of war, promoted by the pre-war military governments, led to poetic-sounding names for warships. Destroyers were allocated names associated with natural phenomena of weather, sky and sea, e.g., wind, kase, snow, yuki, rain, clouds, kumo, waves, nami, mist, kiri, frost, shimo, tides, shio, and the moon, suki. Statistics. Excluding those ships that preceded the first special type, or Fubuki, destroyers, Japan had 68 frontline destroyers in commission at the declaration of war with the Allies, in contrast to the 144 planners had proposed. A further 64 were commissioned during the war, but these failed to compensate for the losses incurred, and the number of ships available declined steadily until mid-1944. There was a further catastrophic decline in October and November 1944, when over 20 were lost. Only 31 survived hostilities. The high level of destroyer losses has been attributed to the poor effectiveness of their anti-aircraft and anti-submarine weaponry and radar, the aggressiveness with which they were used, and their being squandered on supply missions to Guadalcanal. Survivors. Despite the severe losses during the war, some Japanese destroyers survived. They were either scrapped or allocated as war reparation to one of the Allies: China, Netherlands, UK, USA or USSR. Actions. Japanese destroyers performed their usual range of tasks: fleet and convoy escorts, supply and reinforcement runs to various isolated island outposts and garrisons. Japanese destroyers were particularly skilled at night actions and the use of torpedo salvos, tactics which attracted success in several actions. This advantage, however, was reduced by the Allies' use of superior radar and resources. Badung Strait. After the Japanese landings on Bali on February 19, 1942, two destroyers, Asashio and Oshio, were left to escort a transport to safety. In separate night actions, they engaged two superior ABDA flotillas, inflicted damage to one Allied cruiser, HNLMS Tromp, and sank a destroyer, HNLMS Piet Hein. Both Allied flotillas withdrew. Hatsuharu. During the Solomon Islands campaign, 8 Japanese destroyers running supplies were surprised by 5 American cruisers and 4 destroyers. Despite the loss of one of the flotilla, Takanami, the Japanese launched a torpedo salvo to cover their withdrawal. Of the 5 U.S. cruisers, 1 was sunk, USS Northampton, and 3, USS Minneapolis, New Orleans, and Pensacola, severely damaged. At this stage in the war, the Allies were unaware of the range of the Type 93 torpedo, up to 40 kilometers (25 edm). The damage inflicted on the cruisers at Hatsuharu was, therefore, initially attributed to undetected submarines. Cape Street, George. On 25–26 November 1943, 6 Japanese destroyers successfully delivered reinforcements to Buka Island at the northern end of the Solomon Islands. On the return to Rabaul, however, they were intercepted by 5 U.S. destroyers. Exploiting their superior radar, the Americans were able to make a torpedo attack before being detected. 3 Japanese warships were lost: Onami, Makanami and Yugiri, without loss to the Americans. This was the last Tokyo Express supply operation. Classes: Momi. 21 vessels of the Momi class, Fir Tree, were built by Japan and commissioned in the early 1920s as second-class destroyers. They displaced 770 tons standard and carried 3 4.7 in 120 mm guns and 4 21 in 53 cm torpedo tubes. By the outbreak of war with the United States in 1941, all had either been scrapped, reduced to non-combatant roles, or were used for secondary escort work. 5 survived the war and were scrapped soon after. Minecays. 13 Minecays class, Summit Wind ships were commissioned between March 1920 and July 1922. They were developments of earlier classes. Displaced 1,650 tons, full load, and carried 4 4.7 in 120 mm guns and 6 21 in 53 cm torpedo tubes. The sighting of some of the weaponry was poor. 2 of the 4 guns were placed amidships, 1 forward and 1 abaft the after funnel. In this position they had limited arcs of fire, being restricted by the ship's superstructure. 1 torpedo tube mounting was ahead of the bridge and liable to be washed over by heavy seas. By the start of the war, these ships were no longer suitable for fleet duties, being used instead as escorts. 4 survived the war. Wakatake. 8 Wakatake class, Young Bamboo ships were commissioned between September 1922 and November 1923. 7. 1 lost in a storm in 1932. Served in World War II. 1 re-rated as a patrol boat. They were small, 1,100 tons, second-class destroyers, developed from the Momi class. Armament consisted of 3 4.7 in 120 mm guns. 1 replaced by 2 triple 25 mm weapons in 1941, 1,942, and 421 in 53 cm torpedo tubes. Minesweeping and minelaying capabilities were replaced by depth charge launches. As with other destroyers of their age, they were unsuitable for fleet operations by the start of the war with the United States and served as escorts. Their shallow draft allowed their inshore use in China and the Philippines. 1 ship survived the war. Kamakazi. 9 Kamakazi class, Divine Wind ships were commissioned between December 1922 and December 1924. They were similar to the Minecays class, with an enlarged bridge and broader beam to compensate. The construction of this class was cut short by Japan's participation in the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922. Ships of the class were active in several Japanese seaborne landings in Malaya, the Philippines and the Dutch East Indies. In the last case, they defended the landings against the Allied cruisers HMAS Perth and USS Houston at the Battle of Sunda Strait. Two survived the war and were scrapped soon after. Mutsuki. 12 Mutsuki class First Moon ships were commissioned between November 1925 and July 1927. They were developed from the Kamakazi class and introduced the new 24 in 61 cm Type 93 torpedo. These were in triple mounts, allowing the reduction of torpedo placements from 3 to 2. Half of the class were rebuilt in 1935–36, receiving shields to the torpedo tubes, strengthened hulls and modifications to funnels. Further changes occurred in 1941–1942 when many were converted to fast transports with reduced gunnery. All Mutsuki-class ships were lost during the war. Fubuki. The 20 Fubuki class Snowstorm, or Special Type, destroyers were commissioned between May 1928 and May 1932. They were a completely new design and a radical change from their predecessors. The 1922 Washington Naval Treaty had limited the tonnage of Japanese warships and, to counteract this, the IJN sought to build a high-quality, technologically advanced navy. The Fubukis resulted from this. Treaty provisions pointed to an individual ship displacement of 1,400 tons, but this was disregarded. The proposals of 1924 resulted in nearly 1,800 tons. The design changes included 5-inch guns, twin-mounted in weatherproof, splinter-proof turrets, the transfer aft of torpedo tubes from forward of the bridge, a high, covered bridge and an improved power plant. The new positioning of the torpedo tubes enabled the extension aft of the forecastle and thus greatly improved the ship's seakeeping. Two types of turret were fitted. Type A, with 40 degrees elevation, were superseded by Type B with 75 degrees elevation, but neither were satisfactory as anti-aircraft mountings. Anti-aircraft weaponry was otherwise inadequate and it was progressively strengthened during refits, with a final count of 22 25 mm 1-in guns in some vessels. The Type 93 torpedo had proved itself and was installed in this and all subsequent classes. Although an impressive and powerful specification, the Fubukis suffered from design flaws. In order to squeeze the required performance into the required displacement, weight had been saved by the use of light alloys, lighter machinery and the use of welded construction. The reduction of weight within the hulls and the mass of superstructure produced potentially unstable vessels, but this was not appreciated until March 1934. When the torpedo boat Homazuru capsized and the IJN reviewed all of its ships' designs. In addition, 5 ships were severely damaged. In 2 instances, the bows were lost in a typhoon and another 5 had lesser damage to their hulls. As a result, in 1937 and 1938, all Fubukis had their bridges and other superstructure reduced and magazines converted to oil storage. This would act as ballast. The last members of the class to be built were equipped with lighter Type C turrets with reduced elevation, despite the increased weight, to 2,090 tons, leading to a loss of speed by 1 knot, 1.8 km per hour, 1.2 miles per hour. These destroyers remained amongst the best warships of their type. 1 ship survived the war, Akatsuki. The 4 Akatsuki class Daybreak ships were commissioned between August 1932 and March 1933. They were derived from the preceding Fubuki design. They were lighter than the Fubukis, with less powerful machinery. Improved design meant they produced comparable power with just 3 boilers, rather than 4. The bridge was enlarged, and new fire control systems were fitted. Torpedo tubes were fitted with shields, and reloads were carried. They also had the same design issues of stability and hull strength, which were similarly corrected. The resulting increase in displacement reduced their maximum speed to 34 knots, 63 km per hour, 39 miles per hour. Hibiki had the distinction of being IJN's first all-welded ship. 3 were lost during the war, and the lone survivor was transferred to the Soviet Union post-war. Hatsuharu. The 6 Hatsuharu class early spring ships were commissioned between September 1933 and March 1935. They were reduced versions of the preceding Akatsuki design, resulting from the restrictions of the 1930 London Naval Treaty. A further 6 incomplete vessels were redesigned in the light of stability problems and eventually commissioned as Shiratsu-Yus. With much ingenuity, the treaty limitations were nearly adhered to and displacement was a little over 1,500 tons. Despite this, the Hatsuharu retained all but one of the special type's 5-inch guns and introduced the oxygen-powered version of the 24-inch torpedo. They introduced a forward, superfiring single 5-inch gun and retained the tall bridge structure. The impact of the Tomazuru incident, which exposed the instability of contemporary Japanese warship designs, affected the Hatsuharu, and the 2 that had been completed and 4 more under construction were significantly redesigned. The forward single gun was moved aft to a lower position. The bridge and other structures were reduced or removed and ballast was added. Displacement increased to 2,090 tons and speed was consequently reduced. These ships saw service throughout the Pacific, from the Aleutians to the Solomon Islands. All were lost before the Japanese surrender. Shiratsu-Yu. The 10 Shiratsu-Yu class White Dew ships were commissioned between August 1936 and August 1937. They were redesigned Hatsuharus. 6. Later increased to 10. In the light of the Tomazuru incident, these were very similar to the Hatsuharus but with a narrower and deeper hull and greater displacement. 1,710 tons. The gun layout of the Hatsuharu was retained but Type C gun houses were used and the torpedo mountings were quadruples. For the first time, the 4 added ships were further developed, showing an evolution into the succeeding Asashios. All 10 were lost during the war. Asashio. The 10 Asashio class Morning Tide ships were commissioned between August 1937 and June 1938. They were developments of preceding designs with the intention of combining the firepower of the Fubukis with the design stability of the Shiratsu-Yus. The outcome was a displacement in excess of Japan's commitments under the London Naval Treaty, from which Japan had already decided to withdraw. 6 5-inch guns were mounted in 3 Type C turrets, with the 2 aft turrets super-firing, i.e., one turret mounted higher than and firing over the other. Stability was sustained by an increase in the beam. Engine power was increased. Despite preceding experience, there were 2 significant defects in the design. However, rudder design did not give the required turning circle and the stern was redesigned as transom. The new engines suffered damage to the turbine blades, a problem not solved until 1943. The class was active in the landings in the Dutch East Indies, Battle of Midway and the Solomon Islands. All were lost during the war. Cargo. The 18-ship Cargo class Heat Haze was commissioned between November 1939 and July 1941. In 1937, Japan withdrew from the London Naval Treaty and the Kaijuros were designed free of these restrictions, utilizing experience drawn from previous classes. The outcome was a class of ships exceeding 2,500 tons. Solutions to the stability problems of earlier classes were incorporated in the design, with a lower bridge and a slightly wider and deeper hull. Weaponry was restored to the 6 5-inch guns of the Fubukis, in Type C mountings, and 8 24-inch torpedoes, in 2 quadruple mountings with improved reloading facilities, were also fitted. New engines and machinery layouts were used to improve performance and weight. As completed, there was no improvement to anti-submarine and anti-aircraft AA weaponry. Somewhat surprisingly in view of Japan's commitment to naval aviation and the anti-aircraft capability of the subsequent Hikizuki class during 1943 and 1944. However, the AA outfit was improved on the surviving ships and radar was fitted. Ships of the class screened the force that attacked at Pearl Harbor. They were also present in the Philippines, Midway and the Dutch East Indies. One ship survived the war. It was ceded to China. Shimaka's Island Wind, the sole member of its class, was commissioned in May 1943. It was an experimental design, within a significantly larger hull that displaced 2,600 tons. A new turbine design gave 50% more power than earlier designs and enabled trial speeds of over 40 knots, 74 kilometers per hour, 46 miles per hour. The standard 6 5-inch guns were retained but in Type D turrets with greater elevation. The larger hulls allowed 15 torpedo tubes in 3 quintuple mounts. During 1943-44, the AA gunnery was improved and radar was fitted. The class, of which Shimaka's was the prototype, was not ordered. She was sunk in the Philippines in November 1944. Yugumo, the 20 Yugumo class. Evening Clouds ships were commissioned between September 1941 and May 1944. They were continuation of the earlier Kagero class, with some changes. The hull was marginally longer and broader and the main guns were mounted in Type D turrets. The anti-aircraft weaponry was improved during 1943-44. Completed ships had one 5-inch turret removed to allow room for additional 25 mm weapons, but incomplete ones had extra space built in and retained all 6 5-inch guns. Ships of this class commissioned in March 1942 and later were the first Japanese destroyers to be completed with radar, types 13 and 22. All of the class were lost during the war. Akizuki. The 16 Akizuki class, Autumn Moon, ships were commissioned between June 1942 and January 1945. They were originally intended as anti-aircraft ships, but were instead completed as general-purpose destroyers. This class was the first to be equipped with radar. The design diverged from the IJN destroyer standard of 6 5-in. 127 mm guns, instead mounting 8 3.9-in. 100 mm high-velocity guns in 4 high-angle mountings. Their rapid-fire, 90 degrees elevation and excellent AA fire control system provided an effective dual-purpose weapon to the Imperial Japanese Navy for the first time. In fact, the 100 mm range and rate of fire both exceeded the U.S. Navy's standard 5-in. 127 mm. 38 caliber. 424 inches torpedo tubes and depth charge throwers were added as the requirements changed to a general-purpose warship. The heavier gun mountings in the extra super-firing mounting required a significantly larger hull than the Yugumo's to ensure stability. The class displaced 2,740 tons. The class was incomplete at the end of the war. 3 were cancelled and 1 was scrapped before its launch. A further 32 planned ships to improved designs, Arashikaru and Yamatsuki groups, were cancelled due to raw material shortages. 6 Akizukis survived the war, of which 2 were scrapped and 4 were ceded to Allied navies: China, UK, USA, USSR. Matsu. The 18 Matsu class Pine Tree destroyers were commissioned between April 1944 and January 1945. This class were a simplified destroyer design introduced to speed construction times and intended to be used for escort and supply missions. The urgent need for replacements arose from the severe losses around the Solomon Islands in 1942. The design criteria were speed of build, improved damage control and anti-aircraft and torpedo capabilities. The hull design was simplified and shorter than the Fubuki's, partly due to a reduction in the number of boilers, which itself resulted in a significant reduction in speed. The heretofore standard 6.5-inch 50 caliber weapons were replaced by 3 Type 89 5-inch 40 caliber guns, which performed better than its predecessor in an AA role. The enclosed turrets were also replaced by a forward single open shield and an aft twin open mounting. This major redesign delivered a significantly smaller ship, 1,280 tons. A number of the class were modified to transport chitin. 11 additional ships were cancelled and replaced by a greater number of takibanas. 7 Matsus were sunk during the war. 3 were scrapped and 8 were ceded to Allied navies. Takibana. 14 Takibana class Takibana Orange ships were commissioned between January and June 1945. Another 4 were launched but not completed and 5 were not launched before the Japanese surrender. They were a development of the Matsu class, with further simplifications to the design. 4 were lost in ports or home waters in the final weeks of the war, and the remainder were scrapped or given to Allied navies. Weapons systems. Guns. 4.7 inches 45 caliber classes: Momi, Mine Case, Kamakazi, Wakatake and Mutsuki. 127 mm 1914 type Fubuki and all subsequent classes except Akizuki. 5-inch 40 caliber type 89 Matsu. 3.9 inches 65 caliber type 98 Akizuki. 7.7 mm 13 mm classes: Akatsuki, Hatsuharu, Shiratsuyu. Type 96 25 mm at AA gun classes: Asashio and all subsequent classes. Gun mountings: 3rd year type 1914 hand-worked. Type A, 40 degrees maximum elevation. Fubuki. Type B, 75 degrees maximum elevation. Classes: Fubuki, Akatsuki, Hatsuharu. Type C, 55 degrees maximum elevation. Classes: Shiratsuyu, Asashio. Cargo. Type D, 75 degrees maximum elevation. Classes: Shimakas, Yugumo. 90 degrees maximum elevation enclosed. Akizuki. 90 degrees maximum elevation open. Matsu. Fire control. Type 94 Kosha Sochi anti-aircraft. Akizuki. Torpedoes. 53 cm. Momi. Mine Case. Kamakazi and Wakatake. 61 cm Type 93 torpedo. Mutsuki. Fubuki. Akatsuki. Oxygen-fueled in Hatsuharu and all subsequent classes. Radar. The first radar sets were installed in Japanese destroyers in March 1942. Initially in newly commissioned ships of the Yugumo class. This continued at an increasing rate through 1943 and 1944, with retrofitting of existing and even older pre-1922 vessels. Type 13 Aircraft detection radar experimentally introduced in 1941. Widely fitted from March 1943. Effective up to 100 kilometers. 62 miles. Type 21 Used for aircraft and ship detection. Introduced in August 1943. Effective against aircraft up to 100 kilometers and against ships up to 20 kilometers. 12 miles. It was the first Japanese set capable of deriving height estimates for aircraft. Type 22 Used for aircraft and ship detection up to 35 kilometers and 34.5 kilometers, respectively. Introduced in August 1943. It was also capable of gunnery control and became the most widely installed Japanese naval set. Notes. Whitley, Marm J. 2000. Destroyers of World War II. An International Encyclopedia. London. Arms and Armour Press. ISBN 1-85409-521-8. Ireland. Bernard. 1996. Warships of World War II. HarperCollins. p. 92. ISBN 0-00-470872-5.